The strangest thing about that night was not the shiny black sedan parked in front of my porch for far too long. And it was not the fact that my mother was standing at my door after 20 years of silence, as if she had only gone away for a few weeks and come back. The strangest thing was that the first thing she said was not, "How have you been?" My name is Amelia Grant. I am 36 years old, and at an age when people think they have lived through enough not to tremble at the past anymore, I still stood frozen in the evening chill in Austin, Texas, my keys still in my hand, while my mother looked straight at me and said, "We heard you have a son. We need to meet our grandson." What grandson? I do not have a son. I only have a 20-year-old daughter, the child my parents rejected before she even had the chance to be born. My father stood behind my mother, his back straight, his face cold, looking almost exactly the same as he had on that rainy night when I was 16, when he looked at me like I was a mistake that needed to be erased completely. And in those few short seconds I understood why they had come back. Not because of love, not because of regret, but because they had built a lie too big in front of their friends, their church, and their whole town. And now, they needed me, along with a grandson who did not even exist, to save what was left of their reputation. If your family has ever remembered you only when they needed something, then maybe you understand what I felt in that moment. Stay with me until the end of this story. And while you listen, leave me a comment telling me where you are watching from, or whether the people closest to you have ever made you feel like you had never existed at all. If stories like this speak to something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel, because that night was only the beginning. It took me many years to understand one thing. Some houses look so warm, decent, and desirable from the outside that anyone passing by would think the people inside must be very happy. Our house in Charlotte was that kind of house. Every fall, my mother changed the wreath on the front door during the first week of October. Every Christmas, the living room windows were lit before anyone else's on the block. My father wore a pressed suit to church every Sunday, and my mother smiled at everyone in a way that made people believe she was a kind woman. The Grant family was a name people spoke with respect. Only the people living inside that name knew how heavy it really was. My brother Daniel was the pride my father never bothered to hide. Anytime guests came over, he would immediately start talking about Daniel's grades, medical school, and the brilliant future waiting ahead of him. My sister Rebecca was gentle, polished, and knew exactly what to say to keep my mother pleased. She was like a piece of music that never missed a note. And me? I was the extra silence left between those two perfect songs. I cannot remember how many dinners I sat through in silence, fork in hand, waiting for a moment to say something about myself. One time, I brought home a certificate from English class, the ink still fresh, so excited that even standing in the kitchen doorway I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. My mother glanced at it and said, "That's nice, Amelia. Put it on the counter, honey." Right after that, she turned to ask Rebecca about her practice lesson at catechism. My father was listening to Daniel talk about a famous professor at school. I stood there for a few more seconds, then set the certificate down myself, like I was putting away something no one had ever really needed. Things like that happened over and over until eventually they stopped surprising me. They just quietly taught me how to make myself smaller. I learned to speak more softly. I learned not to share too much. I learned not to expect anyone to remember my birthday unless I reminded them. I learned how to fold my feelings up and tuck them neatly into a corner so I would not interrupt dinner, ruin the mood, or become an inconvenience in a house that had already been arranged far too perfectly. My father had a saying he loved to repeat, especially when we had guests over or during those dinners that felt peaceful in a suffocating way. He would lean back in his chair, take a sip of water, and say, "One careless choice can stain a family's name for generations." When I was little, I thought it was just one of those general lessons adults like to say to teach children about responsibility. It was only later that I understood that in that house, reputation was not just something to protect. It mattered more than the truth, more than pain, even more than love. No one hit me. No one yelled at me every day. No one said outright that I was a burden. But they did something deeper than that. They made me believe that if I wanted to be loved, I had to be easy, neat, undemanding, and never a problem. And when a child grows up believing that, she becomes grateful, just because someone is willing to listen to her all the way to the end of a sentence. Maybe that was why, on an autumn afternoon that year, when I was sitting alone in the public library, pretending to focus on a book, while my throat tightened, because someone had forgotten to pick me up yet again, I was completely unprepared for the voice that came from across the table. It was soft, not overly curious, not pitying, and not judgmental. "Is something wrong?" he asked. I looked up, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like someone was looking at me as if I were a real person. I do not know whether my life would have turned in a different direction if Noah had chosen a different table in that library that day, or if I had wiped my tears away a few minutes sooner. What I do know is that he did not try to make himself important. Noah just sat down across from me, slid a wrinkled pack of tissues toward me, and asked in a completely ordinary voice, as if the question were not difficult at all, "What happened today?" Not what had I done wrong, not why was I crying, but what had happened to me. That alone was enough to make my throat tighten again. Noah was not handsome in the way the church mothers would turn and praise. His hands still carried grease stains even after he had washed them. The wind was always messing up his hair. And he always wore an old jacket with frayed stitching at the cuffs. He went to the public school on the other side of town, and after classes he worked at his uncle's repair shop. The pickup truck he drove was so old that every time it started, it sounded like it was negotiating with fate. But Noah had one thing no one in my family had. He knew how to listen without making the other person feel like a burden. We started with short meetings in the library. Then it became walks around the parking lot after school, cups of hot chocolate at the little shop on the corner, conversations that lasted until after dark, and still never felt long enough. Around Noah, I did not have to guess how much I could say before someone got tired of me. I could talk about a bad day, and he would just listen quietly, then say, "Sounds like you had to carry too much in one day." It was such a simple sentence that it hurt, because it showed me that tenderness was not actually rare. I had just never been given any before. Everything between us unfolded quietly and sweetly, with the innocence of being 16. I truly believed that if even one person could see me, then I would not feel lost anymore. Maybe that was why, on the morning I saw 2 lines appear on the test stick in the bathroom of a little gas station off Providence Road, I sat down on the toilet lid and felt the world tilt completely beneath me. I remember how ice-cold my hands were. I remember the fluorescent light flickering overhead. I remember feeling so scared I was nauseous, while at the same time sensing that something very alive had begun inside my body. When I told Noah, he did not run. He took my hand and held it so tightly it almost hurt, his eyes red but his voice steady. "We'll figure it out, you're not alone." I believed him. But I also knew another truth was waiting for me at home. In the Grant house, the first concern would not be whether I was okay. It would be what other people would think. I chose to tell them at Sunday dinner. The table that night was glowing under the chandelier, the napkins neatly folded, the roast set in the middle just like every week. My father was talking about a land deal. My mother was reminding Rebecca about a church fundraiser. Daniel chimed in now and then, polite and measured. I sat there, listening to the sound of silverware against plates, then said, softer than I expected but loud enough to make the whole table go still, "I need to tell you something." 4 faces turned toward me. I could hear my own heartbeat. "I'm pregnant." The first thing my father asked was, "Who is the father?" I said Noah's name. I said he went to public school. I said his uncle owned a repair shop. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. My mother set her fork down hard. "Is there any way to take care of this quietly?" she asked, without looking at me, as if she were talking about a stain on the tablecloth. Daniel looked down at his plate. Rebecca started crying, but she stayed in her seat. My father rose slowly, both hands braced against the back of his chair, then said in a voice I would remember for the rest of my life, "If you keep that baby, then you are choosing that mistake over this family." I do not know where I found the strength to answer him. Maybe it came from fear, pushed all the way to its end. I said I was going to have the baby. I said this was my child. I said I could not do what they wanted just to make everything look proper again. At that moment, my mother stood up. She was the one who went upstairs and got the suitcase first, not my father. She set it by the door like a decision that had already been prepared long ago. When she opened the door, cold wind rushed in carrying the smell of rain and wet earth. She looked straight at me, her face calm in a way that felt cruel. "If you walk out of this house with that child still inside you," she said, "then do not ever use the Grant name again." I stood on the porch with the suitcase at my feet, the rain soaking through my sweater faster than I thought it would. Behind me, the door had already closed, and what I did not know then was that while I stood in the rain, calling Noah with hands shaking so badly, I dialed the wrong number twice. My father had already called the legal assistant at his office and ordered the inheritance papers prepared that same night. As if his daughter's pain needed to be stamped, notarized, and made clean. I pressed the cold receiver to my ear, listening to the ringing on the other end, hoping Noah's voice would answer right away. Hoping someone would come before I started believing I really had been erased from this world. The phone rang for a long time before Noah picked up. I still remember that sound that night. Each long ring, thin and cold, as if the distance between me and the world on the other end of the line kept stretching farther and farther. By the time I finally heard his voice, with the sound of metal clanging and people talking urgently behind him, I could barely get the words out. Noah listened to me cry for a few seconds, and then his voice changed completely. "Amelia, what happened?" I leaned against the wet brick wall beneath a narrow porch awning a few houses down from mine, trying to force myself to breathe evenly. "They threw me out." Silence on the other end. Then Noah said, so fast he was almost out of breath, "I'm on my way to the hospital. Uncle Ray got hurt at the shop, his hand got caught in a press. I'm driving. Where are you? Tell me where you are." In that moment, I felt myself falling all over again, not because Noah was not coming, but because for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it felt like to have nowhere to go right away. I gave him the address, repeated it twice because my teeth were chattering in the cold. Noah said he would come as soon as he got his uncle into the emergency room. He kept apologizing over and over, his voice breaking. I said it was okay, but the second I said it, I started crying harder. It's okay is what people say when they no longer have the strength to say anything more honest. The rain came down harder. I dragged my suitcase along the sidewalk, water splashing up onto my pant legs, my hair plastered to my face. The whole familiar neighborhood suddenly felt terrifyingly foreign. The houses with their lights on, the neatly trimmed flower beds, the windows shut behind white lace curtains. Everything was still safe and undisturbed, while I stood outside it all as if I had never belonged there in the first place. I stopped under the awning of a house a few doors down from mine, just enough to keep the rain from pouring straight onto my head, then wrapped my arms tightly around myself, trying to keep my body from shaking too violently. The door opened a few minutes later. An older woman stood there in a cream-colored cardigan, holding a large bath towel. I recognized her immediately. Lorraine Bennett, the widow who lived alone at the end of the row, the woman who used to be the elementary school principal in the neighborhood. I had seen her a few times when I was younger at community fundraisers. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes not curious, not suspicious, only carrying a deep and serious kind of concern. "Come inside, honey," she said. I shook my head out of reflex as if I still had to keep up the manners expected of a Grant girl. She stepped closer, draped the towel over my head, and said in a voice that was gentle but firm, "Sit down, sweetheart. No child should have to bargain for her worth out in the rain like this." I do not remember when I started crying again. I only remember how golden and warm her kitchen was, so warm it made my eyes sting. She set a mug of hot chocolate in front of me and dried my hair with the towel as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She did not force me to explain right away. She did not ask what I had done. Every now and then, she only said a few quiet things. "Take a sip. You're freezing. You're safe here." Some people save you not with grand words, but by treating you as though your existence is worth caring for. Noah showed up almost an hour later. He rushed through the back door the second Lorraine had barely undone the latch. His jacket still wet with rain, his face pale. The moment he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, he dropped straight down in front of me and wrapped both hands around my shoulders, shaking. "I'm sorry," he said over and over, his eyes red. "I'm sorry. I kept thinking you were out there all alone." I touched his rain-soaked face, and for the first time that night, I felt like I could take a full breath. Lorraine turned away and pretended to look for another mug in the cabinet, so we could have a few seconds alone. But I knew she was quietly giving both of us something my family had just taken away: dignity. That night, the three of us sat in the kitchen until almost morning. Noah told us Uncle Ray was going to be okay. Lorraine asked him how much money he had, asked whether we had anywhere we could truly go, asking in the practical tone of someone who had lived long enough to know that kindness cannot stop at sympathy. We had almost nothing except a few $100s, an old truck, and fear growing bigger by the hour. But strangely, it was in that kitchen, with the low yellow light and the smell of cocoa still hanging in the air, that I felt something the Grant house had never given me. The feeling that I was not a problem to be cleared away, but a person who needed help. 3 days after that rainy night, Lorraine came into the kitchen carrying a thick envelope with a notary seal on it. My name was typed neatly across the front, the letters cold and straight, as if the sender were handling an entirely ordinary matter. I knew who it was from before I even opened it, but I still was not prepared for what it would do to me when I read the first lines. Because that was the moment I understood my parents did not just want to push me out of the house. They wanted to erase me from the history of their family altogether. I read that letter all the way through with my hands ice cold. The language in it carried the tone I knew so well from my father. Not the voice of an angry father, but the voice of a man trying to turn a living wound into paperwork. My full name was there. My inheritance rights were revoked. Every tie to the Grant family was terminated. And the child I was carrying was described with a phrase so cold that I had to stop for a long time before I could keep reading. I folded the letter, set it down on Lorraine's kitchen table, and sat there in silence. Noah sat across from me, both hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He did not speak right away. After a while, he asked softly, "Do you want to keep it?" I looked at the envelope, at the dark red notary seal in the corner, then said, very quietly but very clearly, "I'm keeping it. Not because they allow me to, because she's mine." 2 weeks later, I left Charlotte with Noah for Austin. Lorraine had a former colleague there who knew of a small garage looking for extra help and a church family willing to rent out a spare room for cheap until we could get on our feet. I carried my old suitcase, a few changes of clothes, and Lorraine's handwritten address tucked into my jacket pocket. She stood on the porch, watching us get into the truck, telling me to call the second we got there, reminding Noah to fill up the gas tank before we crossed the state line, then hugging me tightly like family I had known for years. What I did not know then was that she had saved the footage from the old security camera mounted outside her porch. Something she still backed up every month, simply because she was the kind of person who never threw away records, while things were still unsettled. Sophie Carter was born on a sweltering morning in Austin, when the cicadas had started singing in the trees outside the hospital, and Noah had barely slept for almost 2 nights from worry. I still remember his face when the nurse placed her in my arms for the first time. Noah stood right beside me, his eyes red like he could not believe that kind of miracle was real. "She looks like you," he whispered. I looked at that tiny baby, her eyes still barely open, her hand half the size of one of my fingers, and felt something very strange happen inside me. Not all the pain disappeared, but for the first time after so many months of living in panic, I felt there was something bigger than fear waiting for me to keep going. I sent pictures of Sophie back to Charlotte. One photo of her wrapped in a white blanket, sleeping sideways in my arms. No angry letter, no pleading words, just a few simple lines. She was born healthy. Her name is Sophie. There was no reply. A year later, I sent a first birthday card with the tiny print of her hand inside in pale pink paint. Silence again. At first that silence hurt me, but over time it became a kind of weather in my life. Cold, familiar, no longer surprising. Those early years in Austin were not easy, but if I am honest, they were still years with dignity. Our apartment was so small that if you stood in the middle of the kitchen, you could reach out and touch the dining table. In the winter, there were nights when I would go over the electric bill again and again, then decide to put on another sweater instead of turning on the heat. Noah took any mechanic work he could find through Lorraine's contact and anyone else willing to give him a chance. I brought Sophie with me to my high school equivalency classes at night, then worked weekend shifts, waiting tables, babysitting, cleaning, and doing anything else that brought in money. We were poor, but in that little apartment there was Noah's laughter, the smell of slightly burnt toast on Sunday mornings, and the sight of him sitting on the living room floor, playing with Sophie with toys from the dollar store, as if they were the most priceless treasures in the world. Noah did not have much, but he never once let that little girl doubt that she was loved. Maybe that was why, on the day the police officer knocked on the door, I stood so still that he had to say my name twice. The accident happened at the end of Noah's evening shift. A truck crossed into his lane at an intersection outside the suburbs. Noah died almost instantly. Sophie was only 5 then, asleep on the couch with a coloring book still open on her chest. I heard the man standing in front of me say words like impact, instant, we're sorry, but it took a very long time before I truly understood that my life had just been torn in half again. 22 years old, a little girl to raise, almost no insurance money, rent due. There were nights, after Sophie had fallen asleep, when I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator and cried so hard I could not even hear myself clearly anymore. Not the kind of crying that is quiet or graceful. The kind of sound that breaks out of a person after she has been exhausted from being strong for far too long. I did not get back up right away. I broke for a while. I went silent. I was angry at Noah for leaving, angry at myself for still having to get up the next morning, angry at life for always taking away what had only just begun to heal. But the rent still had to be paid. Sophie still needed breakfast, still needed her hair brushed neatly before school, still needed a mother who could stand upright. I started taking small jobs, helping people reorganize their homes, staging empty apartments so landlords could sell them faster, picking paint colors, switching out light fixtures, moving sofas around. I did not call it talent. I just understood what it felt like to be a forgotten space. And maybe because of that, I knew how to make one feel softer. One afternoon, in a townhouse I was helping stage for sale, an older woman wearing a pearl-colored silk scarf walked in, looked around once, then stood for a long time in front of the living room window. She turned to me and asked, "Who made this place feel like someone would actually want to live here?" I told her I had. She nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "I'm Vivian Cole," she said. "I used to be an interior designer before I retired. You don't just know how to style a room, you know how to make a broken place feel like it can begin again." Years later, the very road I rebuilt from rooms like those, one step at a time, led to a business article with my full name printed in it, Amelia Grant. And the last name I once thought had been buried on that notarized paper when I was 16, finally became the trail my parents used to find me, not because they missed me, but because they saw that there was now something about me worth claiming back. That article came out in March of 2022. I remember it clearly because Austin had a light rain that morning, the kind that is almost mist, just enough to darken the pavement, and I was sitting in my new office, looking at the company name on the glass door and still finding it a little hard to believe. Cole & Grant Home Staging had gone farther than anything I could have imagined, back in the years when I had to bring Sophie with me to client meetings because I could not afford childcare. The reporter from Texas Living followed me for almost 3 days, from a penthouse that was being finished to a fabric warehouse in South Lamar, asking about color, light, work, and then finally something deeper than that. Who taught you how to turn a cold place into somewhere people want to stay? I did not answer that question right away. I thought about Noah. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about Vivian. I thought about the empty rooms I used to walk into when my life felt just as empty. The article came out with a title more beautiful than real life had ever been. A teen mother becomes the head of a high-end design and staging company. They praised my eye, praised the way I had risen, called me an example of resilience. I finished reading it, closed the magazine, and all I felt was more peaceful than proud. In the whole piece, I did not mention my parents. I did not mention Charlotte. I did not bring up the Grant name as an accusation. I only said one simple thing: that I had been rejected by my family when I was very young, and that some people have to build a home for themselves before they are strong enough to build one for someone else. By the end of 2024, my life had taken on a shape that the 16-year-old version of me, standing in the rain, would never have dared imagine. The company was growing steadily, and my team was full of people who were both talented and kind, enough that I no longer had to carry everything until 2 a.m. the way I had in the early years. Sophie was already a second-year psychology student, waking up with her hair tied high, a book in one hand and making coffee with the other, as if that were the natural right of youth. Our house was not big in a flashy way, but every corner felt cared for. Light wood floors, linen curtains, the smell of vanilla candles in the living room, the sound of Sophie's bare feet on the stairs at night. It was a home built not with reputation, but with years of living honestly. I had thought my past, at least the part connected to Charlotte, had gone quiet somewhere far enough away that it could no longer reach me. But the internet has its own way of digging up the things people once tried to bury. Late one night, after the old article was shared again on a business forum, a short comment appeared under the discussion. Just a few lines, asking whether I had any connection to the Grant family in Charlotte, North Carolina. An offhand question to outsiders, but for people who had spent years living by hiding the truth, that alone was enough to make the whole structure of lies start to shake. I do not know how my mother found that comment. Maybe through someone from church. Maybe through some woman from a fundraiser circle who liked piecing together other people's biographies to pass the time. What I do know for certain is that she did not come looking for me because she missed her daughter. And it was not because her heart had finally softened with time. She came looking for me because, while trying to rebuild the Grant family's image in the eyes of the community, she had already created a myth too big to take back. At afternoon teas, at charity dinners, in conversations after church, my mother had spoken about her daughter who had moved away, as if I had simply left North Carolina to live a quiet life somewhere else. And from that story, she went one step further. She invented a grandson. A smart, polite, promising boy, a symbol of the next generation of the Grant family. A beautiful heir, just believable enough for her audience to buy the story of family, faith, and legacy that my parents were trying to sell to the whole town. That imaginary grandson had even been given a very specific role. At the charity gala celebrating my parents' wedding anniversary, among crystal glasses, speeches about family values, and applause polished by years of social habit, he was supposed to appear. He was supposed to help announce the Thomas and Evelyn Grant Scholarship Fund. He was supposed to be living proof that the Grant family was not only distinguished in the past, but still had a bright future ahead. There was only one small problem. He did not exist. And once a myth has been told too many times, people begin to need a real body to hold it up. I understood that very clearly in the moment my mother stood in my living room, her eyes sweeping past me, as if she were evaluating the furniture, and said in a voice so smooth it was chilling, "We're all older now, Amelia. Some things should be put back in order." Right, to her, had always meant the surface was right, the frame was right, the story told to the outside world was right. My father was more practical. He talked about the scholarship fund, the donors, the presence of lawyers, the church, the local paper. He emphasized that this would be an important night for the family. Then he lowered his voice, as if he were offering a reasonable condition. "We need your son to appear, just for a few hours. After that, everything will be easier for everyone." For everyone. I stood there looking at the two people who had been silent for 20 years and were suddenly using the word family as if they had never crushed it under their own hands. And what I felt was no longer the old pain, but a cold kind of clarity. They had not found me because of love. They came when the name Amelia Grant appeared in an article elegant enough for them to reclaim, and when they needed a child made of flesh and bone to rescue the lie they had carelessly placed on the altar of reputation. I had not even answered yet when my phone started vibrating on the table. An unknown number from North Carolina. I looked at the screen for a few seconds, almost ready to let it ring until it stopped. But some instinct held my hand in place. I answered, and on the other end, after a very soft exhale, a male voice I knew so well that it made my heart skip rose through the line. Amelia? It's me, Daniel. I had not heard my brother's voice in 20 years, but some sounds are strange that way. They do not disappear, they just retreat to a very deep corner of memory, waiting for the exact moment to return and leave you breathless. I did not answer right away. On the other end, Daniel was quiet too, as if he were trying to find a way back into my life without stepping on everything that had already been broken. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. I know you have every reason to hang up. If you want to, I'll understand, but please, just hear me out this once. I stepped slowly out onto the back porch, gently sliding the glass door shut so my parents would not hear. Austin was fully dark now, and the wind moving through the trees made thin streaks of light ripple across the little lake behind the house. I leaned against the railing, gripping my phone in my hand. Go ahead. Daniel let out a long breath. I should have called a long time ago. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been holding the same sentence inside for too many years. There were at least 10 times I looked up your number. Twice I even hit call, then hung up before it could ring. I kept thinking that if I stayed quiet long enough, then maybe you were okay. Maybe you had built a good life, and me showing up would only make everything worse. But the truth is, I was too afraid to face what I did. Or more accurately, what I failed to do. I closed my eyes. In my head, I saw a flash of the lit second-floor window, a figure behind the curtain, and the rain from that night. Daniel must have guessed what I was thinking, because he spoke again right after that, very softly. I saw you out on the porch that night. Rebecca did too. We stood there, and neither of us came downstairs. I've lived with that image longer than anyone knows. I did not comfort him. I did not say I understood. Some guilt has to be carried by the person who created it. I only asked, so why are you calling today? This time, he answered faster, as if that was the thing he could no longer stay silent about. The grandson is fake, Amelia. I heard him swallow hard. Mom made him up after she read the article about you. She only skimmed it, saw that it mentioned your child, saw that your company was successful, and then filled in the rest with the story she wanted to tell. She started telling people you had a very accomplished son, studying business, carrying himself like a Grant, and the story just kept growing. At first Dad brushed it off, but then he realized it was too useful. People like hearing about tradition, about heirs, about a grandson returning to carry the family line forward. It fit every image they were trying to build. I turned and looked through the glass into the living room, where my mother was sitting upright on the sofa like an elegant guest, while my father stood by the bookshelf looking at my framed artwork as if he were judging its value. A cold feeling ran down my spine. They didn't just lie to a few close friends, did they? No, Daniel said immediately. They've told too many people already. The church circle, the fundraising committees, the donors, Dad's business friends. They're preparing to announce the charity fund at the gala next week. The theme of the speech is legacy, faith, and family. And it's going to be live-streamed on the church page and on the foundation's account. I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Those words collided in my head. Legacy, faith, family. The same 3 things my parents had always used to measure other people's worth. And now they were about to stand in front of cameras, in front of hundreds of people, and turn a lie into a public truth. I heard my own voice drop. So if I don't show up, they'll keep telling that story as if it's real. Yes, Daniel said. And if you do show up the way they want, people will believe it forever. Once it goes out live, it becomes the version of history everyone remembers. I rested my hand on the porch railing, staring at my faint reflection in the glass. All this time, I had thought my parents came here to beg, to bargain, to fix some humiliating private problem. But Daniel had just made something far more frightening clear. They did not just want to borrow me. They wanted to stamp that lie in front of the public, give it lights, applause, and a saved video so that from now on, anyone looking back at my past would have to see it through the frame they had chosen. "Does Rebecca know?" I asked. "She does." Daniel's voice softened. "She wants to be on your side. She really does. But you know Rebecca? She has lived her whole life afraid of Mom. She's terrified that if she steps out of line, she'll lose whatever she still managed to keep with them. Even so, she told me that if you decide not to stay silent anymore, she doesn't want to be the one standing behind the curtain one more time." I rested my forehead against my arm for one brief second. I did not want to admit that those words made something in me ache. Not because of forgiveness. Just because some deep part of me still remembered Daniel teaching me how to ride a bike, Rebecca brushing my hair before church. And that is the most tragic part of every broken family. Tender memories do not erase the hurt, but they do not die all the way either. "What are you asking me to do?" I said. "I'm not brave enough to ask you for anything," Daniel answered. "I just want you to know everything before Mom and Dad turn this into something that can't be taken back. If you come, Rebecca and I won't let you stand there alone. If you don't come, I understand that too, but at least this time, you deserve to choose based on the truth." After I hung up, I stood out on the porch for a long time, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner inside the house and the pounding of my own heart in my chest like a clock someone had just wound too tight. When I went back inside, I did not say anything else to my parents. I only looked at them with an expression that, maybe for the first time in their lives, they could not read. They thought they were still negotiating. But in my mind, everything had already shifted somewhere else. This was no longer the story of one uncomfortable evening. No longer an invitation to show up and smile for pictures. This was a stage built to erase me, all over again. Only this time, they wanted to do it under bright lights and call it reconciliation. That night, after Sophie went upstairs and the house had gone quiet, I pulled the fireproof lockbox down from the top shelf of my closet. The sound of metal hitting wood was soft but heavy. I unlocked it and took out the notarized envelope, yellowed with age. The paper was still there, straight, cold, untouched, exactly as it had been the day it was sent. I laid it on the bed, and then I suddenly remembered something else. Not inside the box, not a signature, not a seal, but something even more real than any legal argument. I picked up my phone, searched through an old contact list I had saved years ago, saw that name on the screen, and understood that, alongside the letter that had erased me on paper, there was still another piece of proof stronger than any story they could tell. Someone who had seen me standing in the rain that night and had never forgotten. I called Lorraine after 10 o'clock that night. I thought I would probably have to leave a message, or wait until the next morning, but she answered almost right away, her voice still as clear and warm as it had been all those years ago. "Amelia?" Just 2 syllables, and yet it sounded as if 20 years had never been long enough to make her forget me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, looking at the notarized letter spread open in front of me. "Yes, it's me." She was quiet for a beat, then asked very softly, "They found you, didn't they?" I told her everything, from the car parked in front of my house, to the story about the grandson who did not exist, to the gala being prepared like a stage for faith and reputation. I did not have to explain much. Lorraine understood very quickly, in the way people do when they saw the truth of things early on. When I brought up that rainy night, her voice changed completely. "I remember every minute of it," she said. "I remember your suitcase soaked so badly it had gone dark. I remember you standing under my porch, still trying to keep your back straight. There are some images no one forgets if they saw them with their conscience." I heard a drawer open and shut on the other end of the line, papers being turned, her moving slowly but with purpose. "I still kept everything," she went on. "Photos with timestamps from the porch camera. A short video, a little blurry, but it clearly shows you and the suitcase. I still have an old notebook too, where I wrote down the date and time, because that night, I almost called the police. I only did not call because you left with Noah before I made up my mind. I closed my eyes. For years, that memory had lived inside me as a truth that needed no proof. But now, hearing her mention each piece of evidence still sitting somewhere in old drawers, I felt for the first time that my past had taken on a shape other people could not so easily deny. The next morning, my inbox filled with attachments from Lorraine. Photos of the porch in the rain, the timestamp resting quietly in the bottom corner of the screen, like testimony without emotion. A short video, low quality, but clear enough to show a girl standing beside a small suitcase, her hair wet and plastered down, both arms wrapped tightly around herself. Then photos of notebook pages written in Lorraine's blue ink, her slanted handwriting steady and even, recording the date, the time, the weather, and one sentence that made me set my phone down for a few seconds before I could keep reading. Girl appears pregnant, forced outside by family, no coat. I sat at the dining table, early sunlight slanting through the kitchen window, looking at those pieces of evidence spread out in front of me, and what I felt was not the thrill of revenge, and not satisfaction either. It was only a deeper kind of calm. The truth, when it has been kept long enough, carries a weight all its own. Sophie came down the stairs while I was still staring at the screen. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her hair twisted up, an oversized sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, looking completely ordinary for a 20-year-old college student on a weekend morning. But the second she saw my face, she set the mug down. "Mom, are you okay?" I turned the phone toward her. Sophie read through each photo and each line of notes in silence. Her face did not show much, but I saw her hand tighten around the edge of the table. She had known this story since she was little. I had never hidden anything from her. I had only chosen to tell it in a way that did not turn her childhood into a courtroom. But this time, she was no longer a child, listening with wide eyes. She was old enough now to understand that some lies, if no one stops them, grow into something that can swallow the truth whole. Sophie looked up at me. "If they want to use a child they made up," she said, her voice very calm, "then maybe it's time they had to face the child they tried to erase from their lives." I did not answer right away. The words stayed in the air for a moment, not harsh, not dramatic, just brutally clear. I looked at my daughter and realized this was no longer just my story, not because I wanted to pull her into an old wound, but because before Sophie was even born, people had already tried to deny her right to exist. And now they were inventing another child to put in her place, one more convenient, more respectable in their eyes, and easier to display. I called Daniel that afternoon. "You said if I come, I won't be standing there alone." On the other end, he was silent for a few seconds before saying, "I meant it." I texted Rebecca too. Her reply came later, only a few short lines, but I could tell from the words she chose that the fear in her was still there. Only this time it was not winning completely. I did not tell either of them the full plan. I only said that I would be there. Not to accept money. Not to play the obedient daughter returning home. And certainly not to hand my parents a chance to repair their image with my face. I was going to make them look at the real consequences of the choices they once called necessary. From that moment on, everything inside me shifted into a different rhythm. I stopped thinking about reconciliation. I stopped wondering whether there was a way to make this hurt less for everyone. I wanted only one thing. Very clearly. The story of my life would not keep being told for me by the people who had tried to erase me from it. If they loved their community, their reputation, and other people's approval that much, then in that very place, in front of those very people, they would have to hear the truth called by its real name. 2 days before the gala, my father's name lit up my phone again. I let it ring all the way through once before answering. He did not greet me. He did not bother with small talk. His voice was cold, low, and sharp, like a heavy wooden door shutting hard. "We are running out of time, Amelia." I stood in my office, looking down at the parking lot in the late afternoon sun. "I don't think this was ever about time, Father." He ignored that completely. "If you refuse to cooperate, we will have to find another way." I trust the child will understand if things are explained properly. For one brief moment, everything inside me went still. And then something in me shut completely. Not because I was surprised, but because he had finally said aloud what he had been thinking all along. That my daughter was just another piece on the board, someone who could be reached, persuaded, maneuvered into saving his dignity. And in that exact moment, I understood that I would not negotiate another word. By that evening, I understood why people like my parents always loved grand hotels. Not only because of the chandeliers, the white tablecloths, or the sound of crystal glasses touching like a kind of elegant music, but because in places like that, everything is arranged to make people believe beauty means truth. The hotel in Charlotte glowed under honey-colored light. Long tables dressed with white flowers and low candles stretched all the way to the back of the ballroom. The waitstaff moved like well-trained shadows. Everywhere in the room were faces used to nodding at the right moment, smiling in the right place, saying things just kind enough to keep their world smooth. Sophie walked beside me in a simple but elegant dark blue dress. I wore black, not to draw attention, but because I no longer wanted anywhere left to hide. The second we stepped through the main doors, I felt the whole room shift just slightly. Not loudly, not dramatically like in a movie, just the way people's eyes began to linger a little longer than usual. A woman near the champagne table leaned toward the person beside her and whispered something. A man I vaguely remembered from our old church stopped in the middle of a conversation, looked at me, then up at the stage. My parents were standing there. My father in a dark tuxedo, his back straight, one hand resting on the podium with the confidence of a man who had spoken before crowds his entire life. My mother in an ivory dress, pearls at her throat, her smile held at exactly the right degree of gentleness. The moment I walked in, my mother saw me first. I will never forget that moment. Her smile did not vanish right away, but it froze, like a thin glaze over something that had just cracked underneath. Her hand tightened around my father's arm. He followed her gaze, paused just slightly, then turned back toward the microphone as if simply continuing to speak might keep everything exactly where it was. "And that is what legacy means to us," my father said, his voice carrying evenly through the speakers. Faith, family, grace carried through generations. I heard the word grace fall into the room like a quiet mockery only I could fully understand. I did not walk fast. I moved one step at a time, Sophie beside me, past the tables draped in linen, past the faces shifting from polite composure to confusion. At the left edge of the stage, I saw Daniel. He had come. His face was pale, but he did not look away when I looked at him. A little farther off was Rebecca, both hands clasped so tightly they had gone white. In the third row, Lorraine sat upright in an ash-gray suit, her leather handbag resting neatly on her lap. And near the large column on the right, Vivian stood quietly like a straight line keeping me from falling sideways. When I reached the steps to the stage, my father finally stopped speaking. He looked at me with that expression that was both a warning and a plea, the same look I had feared all through my childhood. But that fear no longer kept me still. I stepped up, stopped in front of him, and held out my hand toward the microphone. I did not snatch it. I did not fight for it. I simply held out my hand as if asking for something perfectly ordinary. Maybe it was that calmness that unsettled him more than any shouting would have. After one short second that felt impossible to breathe through, I took the microphone from my father's hand. "Good evening," I said, and my voice came out so clear that even I was a little surprised. "My name is Amelia Grant." The room dropped into an even deeper silence. I could hear the air conditioning blowing from above, the sound of someone setting a wine glass down a little too hard, the faint scrape of a chair somewhere in the back. I looked out at the crowd, at the faces my parents had fed with tidy stories for all these years. "Maybe many of you know me through a different version," I continued. "The version my parents have been telling for 20 years. That I left Charlotte to go to Europe. That I have been living somewhere far away, peacefully, still connected to my family in some quiet way." I paused for a beat. I never went to Europe. 20 years ago, when I was 16 and pregnant, my parents threw me out of the house. A soft gasp broke from somewhere in the ballroom. My mother stepped forward half a step, her voice almost no longer a whisper. "Amelia, don't do this here." I turned to look at her. "Here is where you chose to talk about family, isn't it?" Then I looked back at the crowd. "Then here is also the right place to tell the truth." I opened my evening bag and took out the flattened copy of the notarized letter. The off-white paper caught the stage lights like something far too small to carry that many years of pain. "This is the document my father had prepared that very night," I said. "It states that I was cut off from the family, stripped of my inheritance, and that the Grant family no longer had any obligation to me or to the child I was carrying." My father stepped forward, his voice lowered but shaking more than he thought it was. "It was more complicated than that." I kept the paper in my hand and looked straight at him. "No, it was very simple. I was your daughter. I was terrified, and you chose reputation." A wave of murmuring spread through the room like wind across water. I saw phones beginning to rise. On the large screen near the stage, the live stream window was still running, the viewer count climbing little by little. I heard my name falling out of unfamiliar mouths. I heard someone gasp in shock, but I did not stop. "And as for the grandson my parents have told so many people in this room about," I said, every word clear and level, "that boy does not exist." My mother went completely pale. My father stood frozen, as if he had finally understood there was no way to turn these words into some small misunderstanding. I turned and looked down at the front row, where Sophie was standing, her spine straight as an arrow. "Sophie," I called, and she walked up onto the stage in the almost complete silence of the entire room. She stood beside me and took the microphone when I handed it to her, her hand steadier than her age should have allowed. "My name is Sophie Carter," she said. "I am not the perfect grandson my grandparents invented to tell people about. I am their granddaughter. I am the child they rejected before I was even born." No one moved. Daniel was the first one to step up. I watched him walk like a man wading through deep water, struggling but not turning back. He came to stand beside me, facing the crowd. "She's telling the truth," he said, his voice rough. "I was in that house that night. I saw my sister thrown outside. And I did nothing." Rebecca stayed at the foot of the stage for 2 more seconds, both hands pressed tightly together, then finally stepped up too, tears already falling before I even noticed. She did not speak right away. She only stood close beside me, like a late confession that she did not want to stand behind the curtain one more time. From the row below, Lorraine rose to her feet. She did not need a microphone. The calm steadiness of the way she stood was enough to make heads turn. "My name is Lorraine Bennett," she said, loud enough to carry. "I lived a few houses down from the Grant family back then. I saw that girl in the rain. I have photographs, video, and written notes with the date and time. No one here needs to guess whether this is true." The atmosphere in the ballroom broke apart into hundreds of small reactions. Whispering, chairs scraping across the floor, phones buzzing, someone apologizing while squeezing past others on the way out. On the livestream screen, the comments were moving so fast they had become nothing but a bright line rushing by. And in the middle of all that chaos, my father stood there, his face drained white, like a man who had just been stripped of every layer of language he had ever used to hide himself. I knew people were waiting for what came next. A lawsuit, a demand, a number, one final blow. But what I was about to say would leave him more stunned than any request for money ever could. I looked down at the paper in my hand one last time, then folded it neatly closed. The whole room was still waiting. I could feel it clearly in the thin, stretched silence hanging over every table, every face, every phone screen pointed at the stage. People thought I was going to talk about money. Thought I would bring up inheritance, compensation, a lawsuit big enough to match the collapse they had just witnessed. My father probably thought so too, because when I turned toward him, there was not only panic in his eyes, but also the cold caution of a man used to negotiating everything in terms and conditions.